Before we turn things over to our colleague Jeff Greenfield, a quick review of where we are in this tragedy at about the top of the hour. Here are the latest developments. The manhunt continues tonight. 2 new arrest warrants were issued as the FBI continues to round up people described only as material witnesses. These warrants remain sealed, so no details are available to us. Finally, police were back in Delray Beach, Florida today, searching the apartment of one of the known terrorists. The investigation. And in other parts of the story, after huddling with his top military advisors, President Bush returned to the White House today and issued a warning that Tuesday's attacks have, quote, roused a military giant. And finally, the rescue operation continues behind us here in New York City. The numbers are hard to say. 4,957 missing, 190 confirmed dead. In a little less than 11 hours now, Wall Street goes back to work after 4 days of being shut down by the blast. There's an enormous amount of anxiety about what will happen when the opening bell rings, what investors will do, what computers and all the technology will do. They say all things are go. That's the subject of Jeff Greenfield's conversations coming up in a moment. We'll see you again at noon tomorrow. Until then, good night.
Aaron, thank you. The financial world is keeping a very watchful eye on the Asian markets that have already opened tonight. They'll be keeping a watchful eye on the American markets that reopen on Monday. But the aftershocks from Tuesday's attacks continue to ripple through the economy. The American airline industry losses projected at $4 billion for this year. Continental lays off 12,000 workers. The planes that don't fly and the people afraid to fly mean less travel. Hotel rooms stay empty. Chambermaids, bellhops suffer, may be laid off. Security at the U.S.-Canadian border means auto parts don't get from a Canadian plant to an American plant. And Ford says it may have to close 5 of its plants and cut production by 13%. Now, this all may seem cold-blooded in the wake of the death and devastation of Tuesday, but think about it. If Tuesday's attacks also wind up severely hurting the world's biggest economy, that means that those attacks have produced more suffering. So, how big a hit will the U.S. economy take? Is this short-term or long-term? What policies, what actions might the government, might private citizens, might companies take to minimize this damage? Here to talk with us about that are, from our San Francisco bureau, Laura Tyson. She is former chair of the Council of Economic Advisors under President Clinton. She is now dean of the Haas School of Business at the University of California. Here in New York with me, Michael Weinstein. He is acting director of the Geoeconomics Center at the Council on Foreign Relations, was a writer on economic matters for the New York Times and other publications. And speaking of the New York Times, also joining us here in New York, Floyd Norris. He is the chief financial correspondent for the New York Times. We're going to turn to the market situation, but Laura Tyson, I'd like you to put yourself in the position of your old job after this has happened. Now, once the horror fades, specifically, as you start having to think about the impact on the U.S. economy, what are the questions you're asking yourself?
Well, there are a couple of questions. A major question is the effect on consumer confidence. We know that in some ways this is similar to a natural disaster. There's been serious destruction and dislocation. There will be rebuilding. There's also been a temporary loss of production and consumption this week as businesses all over the country stayed shut down and consumers stayed home and thought seriously about many other issues than just going out to buy something. But the longer term question is what happens to consumer confidence? Consumers still account for 2/3 of the economy in terms of spending. Consumer confidence going into Tuesday was already at an 8.5-year low. And was headed, we thought, in a downward direction. So the biggest uncertainty and the biggest risk to the economy is consumer confidence. Now, one of the things that is very, I think, different here in terms of the natural catastrophe analogy is that this has brought people together across the country. It's mobilized people, and that may have a rallying effect. It may have a rallying effect on how people consume, on how they treat government spending, on how they treat the equity markets when they reopen. And that's an uncertainty. That's something that we don't have much precedent for.
Indeed. But speaking of that, would you, if you were today the chair of the council, and the president was asking you for guidance, would you be focused more on what happens in the markets tomorrow, or would you be continuing to look at the broader economy, the consumer behavior that you talked about?
We would certainly be looking at the broader economy. I mean, we said all the time during the administration that I was involved with that markets go up and down, and that we have to look at the long-term set of policies in place, and are they the right set of policies. If the economy has taken enough of a hit through a decline in consumer confidence that there is a tipping into recession, if it indeed that we do have a recession, I would be telling the president that I anticipate that recession would be relatively mild and relatively short, and would of course depend upon policy, but I would anticipate that the Federal Reserve will continue to cut interest rates, that the Federal Reserve has been acting to supply the necessary liquidity to the economy, and has in fact been in conversations with banks about lending, easing up on lending to some of the companies that might have some borrowing difficulties because of disruptions. So monetary policy seems to be well in place. There's a lot of collaboration with central banks around the world. The fiscal policy side, this is really where it gets interesting, because if we are going to have a major effort to rebuild or strengthen our security system, strengthen our intelligence infrastructure, and indeed mount some kind of military action, all of that costs money.
Can you, Laura, can I just interrupt
Sure.
you for just a second and bring some others in?
Sure, absolutely.
All right. Floyd Norris, I suggested in an introduction some ways that one effect can trigger others. As you look at the broader economic picture right now, what are the factors that should either give us the most concern or reassure us?
Well, the factor obviously that gives most concern is that people are scared. There's a lot of fear right now that this will happen again. In Europe, we saw last week, the stock market came down sharply on the news of the terrorism attack, and then stabilized, and then came a lot down more on Friday when Europeans realized how serious this was and how determined our government was to respond with some kind of a military attack. And they're worried this is going to destabilize. As a one-off event, these attacks were serious but not debilitating. This is a huge economy. The effect of this by itself probably would be comparable to a huge earthquake in California. And there'd be even a little good economic news, if you like, out of that. The government, which was running a fairly conservative fiscal policy and talking about Social Security lockboxes and all that went out the window.
What you mean is the government's going to spend a whole lot of money.
The government's going to spend a lot of money. That's going to help stimulate the economy a little bit. On the other hand, people probably are going to pull in their horns, and that's going to have an effect.
And I wanted to ask, forgive me for interrupting, but I may have to, in the course of this conversation, ask for translation from economics to English. But we're doing okay so far. Michael Weinstein, you're a bit of a contrarian in some sense, in that I take it you're a bit skeptical about the notion that we're necessarily in for rough economic sledding.
Well, I think only a fool would make a prediction. We don't have events like this to base a prediction on. There are two facts that are important. One is this economy, as Floyd was saying, is remarkably resilient. And in the past, one-off events, whether it's massive earthquakes in California or the Kennedy assassination or a 20% evaporation of the value of stocks on one day in October of 87, you don't see it in the economy weeks and months later. The economy brushes it off. If this remains a truly one-shot event, the history tells us probably we shrug it off.
But in the Gulf, when the Gulf War, I always thought this was a great irony about the Gulf War, because George Bush, the father, went to 91%, and yet the decline in consumer confidence from the Gulf War was enough to cost us 1 million automobile sales, enough to push us into a recession, which, however mild, probably ended his political fate. Now, if the loss of consumer confidence in a situation like the Gulf War, relatively few lives lost, a relatively quick victory, could do that, even if this is not a repeated event, isn't the sheer magnitude of this enough to drive consumer confidence down sharply enough so that even if it does eventually come back, it's going to really cost a whole lot of jobs and earnings.
That's a plausible story. I don't see any particular evidence in history to suggest that that's a compelling story. I don't know if it's going to be true this time. It could be right, could be wrong. I don't think we know.
Okay.
But let's not forget the other part of Laura's story. We're not passive sheep here. We have a Federal Reserve and a monetary policy. We have Congress prepared to send checks out to people. They've got the right idea for a short-term stimulus. If things turn downward, it's not as if we don't have any levers to pull. So when you have a $11 trillion ocean liner that isn't buffeted very easily, and second, you have rather powerful government levers to pull. Both of them are...
Ms. Tyson, go ahead.
Well, I was going to just agree with Michael and say one other thing, that we are lucky in an important respect here. What was difficult for President Bush Sr. is that he went into that Iraqi invasion with a serious deficit problem and the inability really to run a stimulative fiscal policy. In fact, what he was having to do was to work out deficit reduction packages and tax increases despite his campaign promise, and he was put in a position of having to fund that war but doing it in a fiscally contractionary way. This time around, we have a large surplus. Now, it is true that it is currently earmarked, the majority of it is currently earmarked for Social Security. But it seems to me it makes imminent sense, given that the economy is weak and given that we have this pressing need to rebuild and strengthen our security infrastructure and to take action to bring justice, that we dip into that surplus. We have the room here to actually stimulate the economy and do the right thing from the point of view of our security and military policy, because we have a surplus, and we should all be very thankful for that. That's one of the benefits for not running a deficit, is you have discretion to use fiscal policy the right way.
Let me, though, because I realize that we're focusing on the economy, but what happened here in some ways overhangs economic questions in a way that I don't know that we've ever had to talk about. Let me give you one example. One of the reasons supposedly why investors abroad have been attracted to the United States, it is the capital not only of world power but of stability. It's a safe place to invest money. If investors abroad decide that they no longer believe that about the United States, doesn't that produce major economic problems?
If investors decided they wanted to get out of the United States, given the huge trade deficit we're running, that would create a problem, no question about it, if they decided that for any reason. We have not seen a lot of evidence they want to do that. And one of the reasons this is so shocking to us is that we have been largely free from terrorism the way many industrialized countries have not. London for years had IRA bombings. They dealt with them. I never lived in London during that period, but people went on. And the British economy went on. Thankfully, those bombings stopped. We hope they don't resume. But investments here, the question of whether investments here are going to continue, is going to be based on the perception of the soundness of the U.S. economy, the soundness of our companies.
Not whether or not the United States may be a target for repeated acts of terrorism?
I don't think that's going to be the controlling fact. We're still talking, you mentioned the word stability. And we've still got stability here. Nobody's talking that these terrorism attacks are going to result in the government changing in any way.
Fair enough. Michael, there's another thing about, we grope for past analogies. They're probably inadequate. But here's one that I just want to get your guidance on, and then Laura Tyson, Floyd, if you want to join in. One of the things about World War II was that it came after a depression that had lasted a decade. And in one sense, it was an economic boom. I mean, everybody went to work. The unemployment, shrunk. We were building planes and tanks and jets and uniforms, and Rosie the Riveter was in the factories.
Got us out of the depression.
Okay, exactly. Now, so that while people may have been worried about, for sure, about their loved ones fighting overseas, economically, it was a kind of robust time. If we're in a situation now where people who've been used to 20, 30, 40, 50 years of peace and prosperity are now confronted with a grimmer time, isn't that a remarkably different atmosphere in which consumers will be behaving?
But to tell that tale, you're telling a tale of one bad event leading to another bad event, leading to a lot of consumer withdrawals, and people all of a sudden start saving and don't spend, and the government doesn't react with any offsetting policy. That's a cascading story of bad stuff for which, again, I think you're groping for parallels. Let's just take Floyd's case. Let's assume, or take your case, excuse me. Let's assume that people wake up tomorrow and start selling on Wall Street. Wall Street gives up X percent of its value. Ask yourself the following question. In the 100 years of the 20th century, it's a pretty big sample, 100 years, how many times did Wall Street lead to a downturn in the economy? Any guesses? The answer is one, and that's 1903. I don't think a lot of us are losing sleep over what happened in 1903 in a minor downturn. Again, the economy is just not that fragile. I think that's the wrong image, and it's just belied by one historical episode after another.
Ms. Tyson, let me go back to you and have you wear the hat you wore for a number of years. So you're listening to the folks who know what they're talking about tell you, here are some things to consider. We don't really know where we're going. Now, what in declarative sentences, what do you tell the president, here's what we have to do as a matter of government policy to do everything we can to keep this economy on a good keel? What do you do right now?
Right now, I think I would have advised, and it's happening, an immediate emergency appropriations to infuse additional spending into the economy. We have the additional tax cut coming in. I think the decision to put $40 billion into the economy for reconstruction and helping the families of the victims is right. I think I would advise that we continue to look at the economy over the next few months. As it was made clear, that was a down payment. There should be additional emergency appropriations available at appropriate times. So there's additional fiscal policy stimulus spending. Now, I think some of that might be done in conjunction with the airlines. I think the airline CEOs today were making a legitimate case that the hit to the transportation sector, in particular to air traffic, which is a major source, a major infrastructure for our economy, needs to be considered as a national policy challenge right now. There are ways to put together an emergency loan or a compensation package to help the airlines. I think it's important to consider spending money on taking airport security and making it into a national law enforcement effort. Those things both spend money and stimulate the economy. They also help achieve important objectives, such as keeping the air transport system going and making it more secure. So I would be making suggestions to spend government funds on things that we should spend on in ways that will help the economy right now.
Now, okay,
yes,
I'm sorry, because I think what Ms. Tyson has led us to is a really significant question about the world of economic debate and argument. And again, speaking as an outsider, the gap or the distance between what has happened and kind of traditional economic debate is huge. My question is this going to be a time when the totemic beliefs of people about economics get put aside? In other words, some people will say absolute faith in free markets, don't bring the government into areas it has no business in. Other people will have other beliefs about what the government should do. Is this a case where other considerations totally override traditional economic debate?
I don't think so. I think you're going to have the bailing out of industries. It's remarkable to me, the airline industry has had record profits for several years. This is a first downturn in several years. And they assure us that bankruptcy is coming immediately. It says something about how much money they put aside for rainy days.
But in fairness, Mr. Norris, this is not, we could hardly call this a rainy day. I mean, this is a hurricane.
Perhaps for a hurricane, that is fair.
And that's what I mean. I mean, isn't this the sort of event where the conventional analyses just go out the window?
I think you're mixing apples and oranges on that.
Okay.
You can make an argument that an act of war imposes costs that ought to be socialized, that ought to be spread across taxpayers, and that doesn't run against any conventional wisdom about whether governments ought to be running markets or not. So certainly in terms of the one-off loss to the insurance companies, to the airlines, the cost of the airplanes crashing into the towers and all the fallout from that, you can make a very good argument that we American citizens ought to bear the cost of that. That's very different from picking up the cost of these industries rolling forward. That's a very different issue. For instance, should the ticket price that we pay in the future cover the cost, the true cost of providing security for the airlines? That will raise real questions in Congress and should raise real
But
questions.
that's exactly what I'm asking about.
Yes.
Ms. Tyson, you come in and then Floyd
Well,
join in. Let me just phrase the question briefly, though. I mean, is this not an area where we're going to hear some people say the government ought not to be in the business of providing that security? It's still up to the airlines. That's the argument that we had decades ago, and it was resolved in favor of the private sector doing it.
We didn't just have it decades ago, we've had it in the last decade. There have been recommendations to the Congress to have the air traffic system to have the law enforcement procedures for the security guards. That has been a proposal to make it into an operation that the government essentially funds. So I think it is going to bring up exactly the sorts of questions that you are suggesting. I believe that this country has underinvested in many of the public infrastructure support mechanisms on which the marketplace rests, including, incidentally, adequate investment in security. And that could be from law enforcement to, frankly, adequate investment in intelligence. We haven't spent enough to modernize our intelligence systems. We do not have people adequately trained in the Central Intelligence Agency to understand what is going on in countries around the world. Now, why not? Because we have not been willing to spend discretionary government money. Discretionary government spending as a share of GDP is at its lowest level ever.
I need to Ms. Tyson, I'm sorry, I need to translate here. This is discretionary.
We spend on Medicare,
Right.
we spend on Social Security, we spend on entitlements. The money that the government has at its discretion to spend on justice, to spend on law enforcement, to spend on roads, to spend on public health, to spend on literally all of those things which we take for granted, that we're protected in the health system.
But Laura, you would agree that we don't.
And
Laura, I need to let these other guys come in for
all
a
right, so
second.
I think you're right. I think you're right, Jeff. It's
Well,
going to cause
we
that
don't
debate.
get into. Nobody much disputes that intelligence is a government function. And one can debate how much to spend it on, how not. How much is right, whether the extra $10 billion is useful or not, but you don't get into a debate about whether that's a
But we
private
can-
sector
I
or
wanna
not.
Ms.
make
Tyson, I
another-
need to let Mr. Norris come in. I'm sorry.
Another point about security spending. Obviously, we're going to spend a lot more money in security in this country. Now, whether that money is spent by the taxpayers or by private industry or by individuals, it's going to get spent. And it obviously needs to get spent. But one thing we should understand on the economy is that that isn't going to produce any extra economic output in a real sense. And that's going to be something of a drag on productivity in the country. We're going to have longer lines at airports. We're going to have much more hassle, as you pointed out, getting across the border to Canada. These kind of things are going to be an ongoing small drag on the economy. That's not an overwhelming effect. One of the problems we have, though, which is unfortunate but real, this is happening at a time when every major economy in the world was already either in recession or weakening and perhaps heading toward one. And that is why this right now is going to have a more significant effect, or at least could have a more significant effect.
Could is the operative word.
It
right?
doesn't mean it's going to be a long-term recession. It doesn't mean the end of the world. We've all lived through a number of recessions in this country, and they have pain to various sectors. But the world goes on, the economy revives.
In the time we have left, I want to ask a question that I think Laura Tyson was actually putting on the table. She was making an argument not just about the current situation, but that we haven't invested enough in the public infrastructure. And really, Ms. Tyson, that's really what I was getting at. And let me put the question bluntly. Is this really a time to be debating broader fiscal policy about whether we should invest in our roads or bridges and highways, when what we're talking about is the very real possibility that we, in one way or another, are about to enter a war?
Well, I think that if we are about to enter a war, and if it is going to require sacrifice and a long-term commitment, as the Vice President and the President have said today, then I think we need to recognize that wars must be paid for. And that means that something must be given up. In the Great Depression, coming out of the Great Depression through World War II, we had a huge amount of unutilized resources. So we didn't have to give up much. We just utilized the resources we had and put it into the war effort. frankly, we have an economy which today, even though we've been focusing on its weakness, is still a heavily employed economy. There's not a lot of slack in it. There's a little. If we're going to run a multi-year, expensive war effort along with rebuilding our security system, frankly, we're going to have to pay for it. We're going to have to pay for it by rethinking things like, do we have a $1.6 trillion, $2 trillion tax cut coming in over 10 years? Today, Vice President Cheney said that we needed to sacrifice for this war effort, but he said there was no possibility of repealing that tax cut. Well, what does happen? How do we pay for a war effort? So there are fiscal policy choices here, both of what to spend on and how to pay for that.
All right, and that's what I want to maybe wrap this up with. Here again, are we going to see, Floyd and Michael, are we going to see long-standing arguments, political arguments, economic arguments, wrapped up even in this question of how we go forward to fight what the President and Vice President have said is a war? Are we going to be, in other words, in some kind of consensus? Will people put aside their traditional economic views and say whatever it takes, or are we going to have hassles about how to do this?
Well, of course we're going to have hassles, and in a sense, those hassles are going to be welcome. Because I long, and I think a lot of people long, to get back to some sense of normality, the way things were. And that included some often sterile arguments in Washington about how to spend, where people had their own agendas, and they often, invoked the national interest to support what is a more narrow agenda. That's not great. It's the way democracies work, and I look forward to getting back to those days.
Michael?
I think you're going to have much less of a knee-jerk celebration of of debt reduction, and get back to the more historical arguments about, do we want to invest more in roads? Do we want to invest more in the military? A much more spend here, spend there. With this, it's been a relatively recent, this notion of paying off the debt is the greatest thing you could do, is a relatively recent invention, mostly of Bill Clinton, using Social Security as a weapon against tax reductions. My guess is we get much more back into the historical debate of the best use of resources, both public investment and military.
We're down to our last minute or so, and I want to see if we can get no more than one-sentence answers and no semicolons allowed. Ms. Tyson, should Americans, when they wake up in the next few days, be thinking mostly about the economy, or is the economy going to be pretty much okay, and they ought to be thinking a lot more about safety and how we make our way through this difficult world? In other words, how high up is economic concerns in your mind compared to the others?
I think most Americans should, and I think they will, pay attention to some of the bigger issues that this event raises in terms of what's important, what is safe, what is justice. And the economy is resilient. Policymakers will be able to use instruments of policy. If there's a recession, it'll be, I believe, short and slight. And these issues that have been raised by this tragedy are much more profound.
Mr. Norris?
I think the Americans have to decide whether they're willing to go ahead and live their lives the way they would have lived them before this happened. And the answer to that question is going to help to decide how severe a recession we have.
Michael?
I would be worrying a lot about terrorism and our response to that. The economy will go as the economy would have pretty much gone anyway. And again, as Laura emphasized and I talked about earlier, we have plenty of devices to stabilize an economy if we find out that it's worse than we want.
Okay. Laura Tyson in San Francisco, Floyd Norris, Michael Weinstein in New York. Thank you very much for joining us, and I really do appreciate the high percentage of English to economics that we indulge in. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Now, we have been talking about economics, but all of the things we are talking about, of course, the roots are rooted in what happened Tuesday. And as the U.S. prepares for war, President Bush says that he believes the mastermind behind Tuesday's attacks, what began all of this, is, of course, Osama bin Laden. Earlier today, bin Laden denied any involvement, but yet the president remains steadfast as more and more clues lead back to the declared enemy of the United States. And CNN's Mike Boettcher has this report on Osama bin Laden.
It came without warning. A catastrophic attack on the World Trade Center. Less than an hour later, another terrorist strike at the heart of U.S. military might.
I hope I live. I hope I live. It's coming down on me.
Swirling amid the clouds of smoke billowing from these symbols of power, the terrible question: who could be behind such a devastating act of terrorism? The evidence is still being examined. One name tops the list of suspects. It's a name that's been on the FBI's 10 most wanted list for years: Osama bin Laden.
His organization has both the suicide bombers willing to die in these kinds of attacks. It also has the pilots. It's had a history of training pilots. And also it has basically the level of kind of sophistication and coordination to bring off something like this.
The 44-year-old bin Laden, through a spokesman, denies any involvement. But according to a Palestinian journalist, he congratulated those who carried out the deadly attacks. The ruling Taliban government of Afghanistan, the country where bin Laden is believed to be in hiding, says the Islamic extremists could not be responsible. In Western intelligence circles, bin Laden has been well known for years for this document: a call for jihad, or holy war, against the thousands of U.S. soldiers now stationed in Saudi Arabia. That call to jihad came after 2 bombings of U.S. troops in Saudi Arabia. The first in Riyadh in 1995, 7 dead. The second in Dhahran in 1996, 19 dead, hundreds injured. Bin Laden discussed that call to arms in his first ever television interview with CNN in 1997.
We declared a jihad, a holy war against the United States government because it's unjust, criminal, and tyrannical.
Bin Laden wants U.S. troops out of Saudi Arabia. He opposes U.S. bombing campaigns in Iraq. He is against U.S. support of Israel. And he objects to U.S. backing of Arab nations he deems un-Islamic, such as Egypt. Bin Laden has been indicted as the mastermind behind the bombings of 2 U.S. embassies in Africa that killed 224 people in 1998. He is a prime suspect in the bombing of the USS Cole last October. That blast killed 17 U.S. sailors. And the U.S. State Department has linked him to the first attack on the World Trade Center in February of 1993. 6 people were killed and thousands injured.
The man is ruthless, and he believes that he should declare war against the United States. And this kind of appeal, this kind of call actually appealed to many young Muslims all over the world.
A videotape circulating around the Middle East and on the internet surfaced just 3 months ago. It shows bin Laden training young militants, some who seem as young as 11, for his holy war. Bin Laden makes an impassioned plea for recruits in the 2-hour tape. The videotape also hints that bin Laden is planning additional anti-American operations.
One thing that bin Laden does before a big attack happens is that he subtly indicates several months before, or a couple of months before, that something's in the works.
The man codenamed the Contractor has used his enormous wealth to advance those militant plans. He was born the son of a multimillionaire Saudi construction magnate. He's the 17th of 52 children, some of whom live in the United States. His father died when he was 10. The family construction business, the largest in Saudi Arabia, is now worth an estimated $5 billion. Osama bin Laden's first marriage was to a Syrian cousin at the age of 17.
His education took place at quite a good university in Saudi Arabia, where he studied public administration, economics. He'd also already participated a little bit in the family business. From a young age, he was involved in the family business. This is not an unsophisticated guy. This is somebody who comes from one of the most well-connected families in Saudi Arabia, one of the richest.
He would later draw on the resources of his family business and his experience as a demolitions expert. After the Soviets invaded Afghanistan in 1979, his life would take a radical turn. Bin Laden has been in Afghanistan on and off since the 1980s, when he joined the Afghan resistance in its war against the Soviet Union. At 23 years of age and deeply religious, Osama bin Laden left his comfortable life in Saudi Arabia to fight alongside thousands of volunteers from the Islamic world. He used his family wealth, construction equipment, and demolition expertise to help in the crusade, and he would become a leader of the so-called Afghan Arabs.
Because of that, a lot of people wanted to participate in jihad, and they thought that Osama is an important figure. But he was not only willing to put his money, but he actually gone there himself and fought himself and get hurt.
The Afghan war changed bin Laden. He saw a lightly armed guerrilla force defeat a superpower.
In this jihad, the biggest benefit was the myth of the superpower was destroyed, not only in my mind, but also in the minds of all Muslims.
The Afghan war also radicalized those who fought there.
These Saudis who went and fought became convinced that you simply didn't have to accept regimes as they were, that as a Muslim you could take action against a ruling government.
For the U.S., there is a sad irony to bin Laden's current holy war. American tax dollars once helped support people aligned with bin Laden. During the 1980s, via the CIA, the United States poured $3 billion into the Afghan resistance that was fighting to drive the Soviets out of Afghanistan.
It is true that some remnants of those Afghan fighters, including bin Laden, have used their military knowledge and their skills to branch out into international terrorism.
Indeed, many of the Afghan freedom fighters are among the thousands of committed followers bin Laden has today throughout the Middle East.
They are either direct followers, taking direct command and order from bin Laden, or they are small cells and groups who believe bin Laden is a godfather. His message is almost like a religious order.
After the Afghan war, bin Laden became disillusioned with the Saudi regime, deeming it insufficiently Islamic. He moved to the Sudan. 5 years later, under U.S. and Saudi pressure, bin Laden was expelled from the Sudan. Bin Laden took refuge in Afghanistan, perhaps the only country in the world that would accept him. It was here in 1997 that then CNN producer Peter Bergen caught up with him.
And we went to Afghanistan, to the tiny town of Jalalabad, which is in the eastern Afghanistan, waited around for quite some time. Finally, bin Laden's media advisor came and talked to us. He said, you can only bring the clothes you're wearing, don't bring any watches, don't bring anything that might secrete some sort of tracking device. We took a curtained van, along a road, along a river. It was by now getting to be dusk. We were given kind of sunglasses which basically they weren't blindfolds, but you couldn't see through these things. We finally got to this hut about 5,000-6,000 feet up in the Afghan mountains. It was March, so it was pretty cold. Suddenly bin Laden appears out of the darkness.
In our 1997 interview, bin Laden expressed why he so hates America.
The U.S. government has committed acts that are extremely unjust, hideous, and criminal through its support of the Israeli occupation of Palestine. And we believe the U.S. is directly responsible for those killed in Palestine, Lebanon, and Iraq. Due to its subordination to the Jews, the arrogance of the United States regime has reached the point that they occupied Arabia, the holiest place of the Muslims, who are more than 1 billion people in the world today. For this and other acts of aggression and injustice, we have declared jihad against the U.S.
Bin Laden said the jihad was aimed principally at U.S. government targets overseas.
We have focused declaration of jihad on striking at the U.S. soldiers inside Arabia, the country of the two holy places, Mecca and Medina. In our religion, it is not permissible for any non-Muslims to stay in Arabia. Therefore, even though the American civilians are not targeted in our plan, they must leave. We do not guarantee their safety.
When this guy delivers his statements attacking the U.S. presence or his call for jihad, he is justifying these actions in very explicit Quranic, Islamic terms with a long, it's like a careful legal brief that he's drawn up here.
And bin Laden and his followers have backed up his call for jihad time and again. Somalia, 1992. 28,000 U.S. troops are dispatched on a humanitarian mission to a Muslim nation embroiled in famine and civil war. U.S. soldiers are caught in the crossfire. 18 are killed. In his first admission to a U.S. news organization, bin Laden says Arabs who fought in Afghanistan, men who looked to him as a leader, killed those U.S. troops.
Resistance started against the American invasion because Muslims did not believe the U.S. allegations that they came to save the Somalis. With Allah's grace, Muslims in Somalia cooperated with some Arab holy warriors who were in Afghanistan. Together, they killed large numbers of American occupation troops.
He's brazenly said that his people were responsible for that, so we take him at his word.
It is not the only attack on U.S. troops linked to bin Laden. The U.S. government says that bin Laden forces attempted to bomb U.S. servicemen on their way to Somalia. The bomb killed 2, but no U.S. soldiers. Then there is the possibility of a bin Laden connection to 2 bombings in Saudi Arabia, at Riyadh in 1995 and Dhahran in 1996, that left a total of 24 U.S. troops dead.
It's no secret that during the 2 explosions I was not in Saudi Arabia, but I have great respect for the people who did this. They are heroes. What they did is a big honor that I miss participating in.
The Saudi government accused these Saudi citizens of planting the Riyadh bomb. 3 of the 4 men were Afghan Arabs who fought in the war against the Soviets. They acknowledged their role, probably under duress, and were later executed.
According to experience in explosives which I gained during the Afghan war, I assembled the bombs in this car.
They also acknowledge bin Laden's teaching.
We received pamphlets from Osama bin Laden and others.
The U.S. government also points to bin Laden's circumstantial ties to the bombing of the World Trade Center in 1993. Ramzi Youssef, mastermind of that attack, afterwards fled to Pakistan, where he lived in a guest house for Islamic radicals funded by bin Laden. Bin Laden denies this.
I don't know Ramzi Youssef. What the American government and Pakistani intelligence has been reporting isn't true at all.
The man considered the spiritual leader of Ramzi Youssef and the 1993 World Trade Center bombers, Sheikh Omar Abdel Rahman, also has links to bin Laden. The State Department says that bin Laden finances a training camp in Afghanistan for 2 Egyptian terrorist groups that look to Sheikh Rahman as their spiritual leader.
Sheikh Omar Abdel Rahman is a Muslim scholar well known all over the Muslim world. He represents the kind of injustice that is adopted by the U.S. A baseless case was fabricated against him, even though he is a blind old man.
In 1998, Rahman's sons joined forces with bin Laden. During a rare press conference in Afghanistan, bin Laden dropped hints of another strike at U.S. interests overseas.
He talked about good news in coming weeks.
9 weeks later, it would become clear exactly what that good news was.
He's alive! He's alive! He's alive!
On August 7, 1998, at about 10:30 a.m., a car bomb exploded outside the U.S. Embassy in Nairobi, Kenya. 9 minutes later, and hundreds of miles to the south, another explosion outside another American embassy. this one in the Tanzanian capital of Dar es Salaam. More than 200 people were killed in the two-pronged attack. One of the plotters, carrying a poorly forged passport, was detained at Pakistan's Karachi airport just hours after the bomb went off. He later confessed his involvement to intelligence officials. Another suspect was arrested by Kenyan officials and handed over to FBI agents. He confessed to his role in the bombing during a week of interrogations. Bin Laden was later implicated in the attack.
On the embassy bombings, you've got the best law enforcement case indicating bin Laden's involvement. You have a plea bargain of one of the senior members of the organization basically saying, he sent me to Kenya in 1993 to go and photograph the embassy there, and then when I showed him the photographs, he said, that's where we can put the truck bomb. Case closed.
13 days after the bombing, U.S. cruise missiles rained on bin Laden targets in Afghanistan and Sudan.
Today, I ordered our armed forces to strike at terrorist-related facilities in Afghanistan and Sudan.
But bin Laden emerged unharmed. He and his key aides had anticipated the U.S. would retaliate and vacated their main training camp in eastern Afghanistan. The unsuccessful attack elevated bin Laden to cult figure status among Muslim fundamentalists. New Year's Eve 2000. Amid fears concerning the Y2K bug, a different kind of catastrophe was waiting to happen. Terrorist plans to attack celebrations in Seattle, bomb LAX airport in Los Angeles, sink a U.S. warship refueling in the Middle East, and bomb tourist sites in Jordan. The attacks were foiled. They were linked to followers of bin Laden. Later last year, on October 12th, an attack that didn't fail. Two suicide bombers pulled a small boat alongside the USS Cole as it was refueling in Yemen. The blast blew a hole the size of a house in the hull of the Navy destroyer and killed 17 U.S. sailors. U.S. intelligence officials say bin Laden's fingerprints are unmistakable. During the last several years, it is believed bin Laden has been hiding out in the remote mountains of Afghanistan, a rugged terrain he knows very well. The country is dominated by the Taliban, a movement of religious students turned warriors who have imposed their harsh interpretation of Islam. The Taliban have declared that bin Laden is their guest, providing he does not attack other nations. The shadowy figure made a rare public appearance in a videotape that emerged from Afghanistan at the beginning of this year. It shows bin Laden at the wedding of his son to the daughter of a longtime aide. So far, bin Laden's elusive ways have kept him beyond the reach of U.S. law enforcement. He is thought to change his residence continually, often moving at night. But he still manages to get his message out.
They've essentially fused two very different things. One is a sort of almost medieval reading of Holy War, based on some medieval Muslim scholars with the most up-to-date technologies available today. I mean, bin Laden and his folks use satellite phones. They use the internet to get their message out.
Bin Laden's latest message, in the propaganda recruiting video that surfaced this summer, implies more action aimed against the United States.
On the tape, bin Laden specifically says, basically, I was responsible for these series of anti-American attacks, including the Cole in Yemen, and he concludes the tape by saying, the victory of Yemen will continue.
In his interview with CNN back in 1997, he made this chilling warning about his future plans.
You'll see them and hear about them in the media, God willing.
CNN's Mike Boettcher, and I apologize, in my conversation earlier with Aaron Brown, I misleadingly suggested what you were going to see was Peter's interview with bin Laden from 1997. What you saw was Mike Boettcher's profile. Still, few Westerners have had contact at all with Osama bin Laden, and CNN's terrorism analyst Peter Bergen, as I mentioned, as the piece told you, did have an opportunity to meet bin Laden while producing an interview for CNN in 1997. He joins us with more. Peter, good evening, or good morning almost. Here I think is a question that must puzzle anyone who watched this piece. In the twisted logic of bin Laden, one can at least understand attacks on Americans in other places. They're in Saudi Arabia, where non-Muslims are not supposed to be. They're in Somalia. The USS Cole is in waters around Yemen. When did it begin to become clear that he or someone was prepared to take these tactics to the United States, not aimed at soldiers but civilians, and inflict the most horrific sorts of death on thousands of people?
Well, I think it's clear from what we know about some of the suspects. Some of them have been in this country in the United States since as early as 1994. So this plan has been in the works for quite some time. And I think if you look at the first bombing of the World Trade Center, a lot of bin Laden's people were sort of on the peripheries of that. And I think they basically came back to do what they had started. Why are they attacking the United States directly rather than the Middle East? I think perhaps if you're a terrorist, you have a political mission in mind, right? You don't just blow things up for no purpose. And bin Laden may be perhaps frustrated that his actions against the U.S. embassies in Africa and also against the Cole didn't really get any discussion going about what he's actually asking for. I think that we've begun to talk a little bit about what his demands are. I'm not saying that his demands are in any way negotiable, since they are rather comprehensive, including the withdrawal of U.S. troops in Saudi Arabia and basically changing U.S. Middle Eastern policy entirely. But at least they're being talked about. I mean, I don't think this guy is a madman. I think that he has, his outcomes may be mad, but I think his underlying logic is that by drawing attention to what he's saying, and perhaps out of frustration that his previous actions really didn't get much examination of the message he's trying to get out. Perhaps that's why these attacks have been undertaken.
Is there, if in fact this results in regimes like the Pakistani government in fact changing radically its policy, is there any notion that even within his own world he might conclude that this was a grave mistake, that it's the straw that broke the camel's back, that even allies or sympathizers within his own world would just say, that's beyond the pale?
I think he's looking on this, we don't know 100% yet, but it's 98% that it was him, as a fantastic victory. And my concern really is the following. On Monday, before the Trade Center bombings, I think bin Laden was, regarded as being a pretty smart guy in terms of terrorist attacks. Tuesdays are so Machiavellian, so devilishly brilliant. I mean, you're dealing with somebody who's really quite smart, and he has thought through certain things. He has thought through that there's going to be an American response. He's not sitting there waiting for that response to happen. He's thought through what that response might be, and presumably is planning his own response to it when it does happen. And I think a very significant thing, Jeff, is that about 24 or 36 hours before the Trade Center blast happened, Ahmad Shah Massoud, the very well-known and distinguished general who was leading the opposition to the Taliban, was assassinated by two Arabs who was almost certainly working for bin Laden. So bin Laden was already thinking through what the next stage would be, because if the United States is going to go into Afghanistan, one of the first ports of call would be the alliance fighting the Taliban, asking them for information, asking them for military help, and by assassinating the man who basically held that coalition together against the Taliban, and who was also a rather brilliant general, you've got rid of a potential problem immediately. So I think my concern now is that bin Laden is planning some other way. Perhaps the Trade Center is almost a come-on for the United States to come in and face whatever plan he has. And I don't want to go ahead.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Peter.
I don't want to paint him as sort of the most brilliant guy in the world, but I mean, I think that Tuesday's events show that we're dealing with somebody an order of magnitude smarter than we were dealing with previously, and somebody who seems to have wrong-footed the United States government at every step. The U.S. embassy bombings in Africa, the United States was worried about stuff in the Middle East. The United States wasn't worried about Africa. The bombing of USS Cole in Yemen was an unprecedented attack on a U.S. warship. No one had conceived that that might be possible. Obviously, the Trade Center thing, you've got dozens and dozens of people who are in some way implicated in this. You think about the discipline of this organization, Jeff. You've got to have, we have 19 hijacking suspects who died on those planes. They must have 2 or 3 Confederates. So that's somewhere a figure between 50 and 100 people. None of these people blabbed about what their plans were. None of them made stupid mistakes that got them arrested. The cells operated in an extremely secretive way, and the United States government, despite the fact it spends billions of dollars a year on counterterrorism measures, had no inkling of this.
So
it's a very disciplined group.
What you're suggesting is that in some sense, if the United States we have strongly implied we're going to do, goes after states that have given aid and comfort to bin Laden, that he is in fact playing a chess game in which he is one move ahead of us, that he's anticipated that and has a strategy to deal with that, or a counter move?
I would say this assassination of Massoud by his people, the leader of the opposition of the Taliban, is an indication that I don't think this is a coincidence that you're removing the main opposition to the Taliban, his allies, within 36 hours before this trade center bombing took place. I just think the order of coincidence is too high. Massoud has been fighting the Taliban for 5 years. Suddenly he disappears off the face of the map because of an assassination by bin Laden's men. I think they're related.
All right, Peter Bergen, CNN analyst, one of the few Westerners ever to talk to Osama bin Laden. Thank you very much for joining us. I suspect there are some more sleepless nights ahead based on both what you've said and what we've seen. Thank you, Peter. Speaking of possible responses, the Pakistani delegation has arrived in Kandahar, Afghanistan. This team reportedly plans to issue an ultimatum, hand over Osama bin Laden. And CNN's Kamal Haider joins us on the phone from an undisclosed location in the region. Good morning or good evening to you, as the case may be, Kamal.
Yeah, it's 8:30 in the morning over here, Afghan Standard Time. This delegation has arrived in Kandahar. They are basically carrying a message from the U.S. authorities. So basically they're only relaying that message. They're expected to meet with Mullah Omar, the Supreme Taliban leader, this morning in Kandahar. The mood, meanwhile, in Kandahar remains defined, and there's very little expectation from this meeting, except that the letter or the concerns of the U.S. government are to be handed over to the Taliban authorities. Jeff?
Kamal, given the past support from Pakistan for the Taliban, economic support, political support, and I'm going to ask this very bluntly, are we to take this at face value, or is there some sense that what we are seeing is something of a piece of stagecraft designed to make the United States feel better without accomplishing anything?
Well, I think the Pakistan authorities have in the past had a good relationship with the Afghan governments, consecutive Afghan governments, because of Pakistan's 20 years of involvement in the Afghan war, in the sense that Pakistan was a frontline state against the Russian occupation of Afghanistan and a great ally of the United States. The Pakistani authorities have lost the leverage that they used to have on a government which acts more independently. Afghans have always made their own decisions in the end, and they have not been subservient to anybody, be that Pakistan or any other power. Jeff?
Kamal, I'm not going to ask you to predict the likelihood of success, but if the Taliban does not do what the Pakistani government says it wants, what response can the Pakistani government make? Kamal?
Well, the Pakistani authorities have made it very clear that they stand with the international world on this issue. I think the talks between the Pakistani and American authorities have established that Pakistan is likely to provide America with all possible assistance. Those signals are coming from the foreign ministry. Internally within Pakistan, there is tremendous opposition because they feel that Osama bin Laden is being used as a scapegoat. And here in Afghanistan, there is now a feeling emerging that they should keep the doors of negotiations open and not slam them shut. So at this moment in time, the Pakistani authorities nor any other government can prevail on the government of Afghanistan. They seem to be making decisions on their own without taking into account what that may have for them as a future, for their future. Jeff?
Kamal Haider, thank you very much for joining us. You can tell the nature of this story by the fact that all we can say is that he is at an undisclosed location in the region. Now, coming up for the next couple of hours, something new at CNN.